Welcome to Time to Teach with Tammy, the podcast that gives tips, advice, and suggestions to teachers by a real teacher. So sit back and enjoy. And oh yeah, don't forget to subscribe. And we're back. Welcome to episode 96 entitled This is the Curriculum. Today's episode is pretty much influenced by something that's happening here in Mexico. So if you guys have listened before, you know I live in Mexico. I'm actually from California in the United States, but I've been living here since 2009. And there's a big protest and strike that's going to be happening very soon on behalf of women. And it's basically speaking out against femicide, against violence against women. And it's a very big deal. And of course, this is something that we have been addressing at school in a very student appropriate manner. And it really got me thinking about how the things that are happening in our world is truly the best curriculum that we can have, especially if you're someone like me who feels like education is a means to better our society, to positively impact the world. And a large part of that is due to what's happening in our world. What are the things we need to improve? What are the movements that exist that we can seize and we can be part of and we can help move things forward? So that is what today's episode is going to be all about. I don't really expect today's episode to be too long. I just kind of want to share a little bit of my experience and how I'm addressing this with my students and maybe give a few ideas of things that we can do in the classroom. I certainly don't use enough current events, which this whole thing got me thinking about how current events can be used in the classroom, because this is such an important day that's coming up for Mexico. There was no way to not address it. I just feel like when things like this are happening, we really have to talk about it with our students, make sure they're understanding, or at least hear from them, see their experiences. I just feel like we're really obligated to do that. So, but like I said, it did get me thinking that I really don't use enough current events. Granted, not all current events are quite at the same scale as this. And because I'm teaching in an international dual immersion school, it's a little bit different because my time is very limited. I have very little time with the students, really just a little over 3 hours a day. So having less time does not make it easy to incorporate all the things I would love to. But anyway, let's go ahead and get started. I will say I woke up with a sore throat, so my voice is very scratchy, which I think is going to affect the sound a little bit, but it is what it is. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, first thing I have to say is the discussion piece in your classroom is so important. It is huge. We just cannot underestimate the powerful impact that a discussion can have. And I think we all know that, but sometimes you kind of feel like we're not producing something that can be turned in, that we can hang on a wall, that we can show everyone. Sometimes it feels like could lead you to feel like it's not as important, but I think we all know discussions are so important. And it helps you to kind of just gauge where your class is, see what prior knowledge and understanding they have, hear from them. it's giving them a voice, which is excellent, especially when we're talking about topics that can, we might have differing opinions. I think we can all agree on equality for women and being treated fairly, but it does kind of give you an insight of their thinking and what their opinions are. And even though I'm talking specifically about this issue, I want to kind of address this as any issue going on. So some are not going to be as heated or to the same degree as this current topic is. So anyway, just having a discussion is super important, finding the time. I had to kind of think about my day. Okay, when are we going to be having these discussions? Because I also didn't want to have a one and done kind of conversation and then move on. Obviously, this is an ongoing conversation. And with my students, because they are very young, we're not getting into the, all of the aspects surrounding this this protest. It's basically just looking at it through the lens of equality and fairness, equal rights. So that's how we're addressing it. But anyway, I had to look at my schedule and decide when is the best time. And I just decided pretty much first thing in the morning, because that's when naturally we kind of talk about what is our day going to look like, what are we going to be doing, all of that wonderful stuff. But then I also open up reading workshop in the morning, and we will usually do like a shared reading, which will include a book and typically a couple of poems. So I thought, okay, instead of doing that, we'll be having our discussions and maybe taking that time to still read, but read about women who have contributed to the world and done great things and achieved a lot of, whatever they've achieved. So looking at my schedule kind of helped me to decide a time and a place. I ended up getting sick last week, so some of the things I had planned, unfortunately, I could not do, because that is the way life dictates when you are sick. However, I am planning on continuing the conversation this coming week so that I can continue and discuss some of these things with my kids and continue the conversation. So this is a perfect segue into using literature as a way to talk about topics and themes and current events. So since we're talking about fairness and equality, the first day that we started to talk about it and kind of keeping it more to what the kids understood, what was appropriate for them, sports, maybe sports not being fair between the different genders. And then we learned about Frida Kahlo, which for my students, we're here in Mexico. If you're not familiar with Frida, she's a very famous Mexican artist. So my kids had background knowledge, but we read a book all about her life to celebrate her. And I wanted to start with a Mexican woman because obviously being in Mexico, I want to look at this globally, but I wanted to start there because I just felt like that was important to embrace the immediate culture. So that was really good. The kids loved learning more about her life. They seem to know a lot about it already, but we read a really nice book that explained a little bit about her childhood and how she got into art, and it was really good. And the pictures were really nice. So my kids really enjoyed listening to it and looking at the pictures. And then I have left the book, like I do with anything we read. I leave it out during their reading time so they can go and they can read it on their own for a while. So that was good. That was our first day. And then our second day, we continued the conversation. I reminded the kids what we had already talked about. And then I told them, in some countries, girls are not even allowed to go to school, or it's hard for them to go to school. They don't have the same access to education, or maybe just might not even be allowed, period. So from there, we were able to talk about Malala, which for a couple of my kids had heard of her, but it seemed like for most of my kids, they really didn't know that much about Malala. So it was really good. I got to show them a map and show them where Pakistan is, and we're in relationship to where we are. So it was nice. Brought in a little bit of geography. So that was interesting. They were able to look at that and be like, wow, like there's many places in the world where this is an issue, where women and girls are not treated fairly. It's all over the world. So it's nice for them to see that. I felt like that was impactful. And then Get Epic is a great website, you guys. If you're not familiar with it, I do encourage that you become familiar with it. There's a lot of great books on there, and there are several actually about Malala. So I was able to use one of those books to then read to them and teach them a little bit about Malala's life. Now, originally, my plan had been that this was going to be a class meeting talking about this issue. And we would read about Malala's life, and they would sketch note about Malala's life. But that was planned for when I was sick. So I still ended up teaching them about Malala, but I didn't have them do the sketch noting. I will be bringing sketch noting into what we do. But I did not do it then, and I might just end up having them sketch note about many different women. I don't know. To be determined. So many different options. Anyway, so we did that, and they enjoyed listening and learning about Malala. That seemed like I said, a lot of new information for them. And then, of course, after we read the book, I had them think about something they learned about Malala's life, and then had them turn and talk. And then I shared out a couple of points that the students had discussed. So that's pretty much what we have done so far. I am going to continue with this topic this coming week. So we will be having a class meeting where we can continue to dive in more. And I actually am thinking in our class meeting, again, we're going to continue by celebrating girls and women, and I'm going to have them write about an impactful woman in their life. So it could be any woman in their life who is meaningful, who they kind of want to take a moment to celebrate, to thank. Could be a mother, could be a grandmother, could be an aunt. It could really be anyone. But the idea is to really take a moment to reflect on how that woman in their life is really impacting them. What are the things that they do? What are the things that they do to make your life better? I think that's what we humans do when we are interacting. We're really making someone's life so much better, even if it's just by having that contact with them and the social aspect. So I really want them to be thinking about it. If it's my mom, what is it that she does that I really appreciate, even if it's just, she wakes me up in the morning. I mean, come on, moms do so much. But I want them to even think about on the small things, waking me up in the morning, all those things that are helping them and, making a difference in their life. So that is what we will be doing this next week during our class meeting. Now, for the rest of the week, I plan on continuing to use the morning time as a time to continue to talk about the issue, read my students a different book a day, probably each one highlighting a different important historical woman, and a couple of other activities. I'm sure I'm going to throw some other things in, but a couple that I'm very much thinking about is writing an all about book. So it might be all about the different important women that they've learned about, or they might just focus on one. I'm going to kind of see how that goes. And it works out very perfectly. We happen to be in a persuasive writing unit. So I am going to have them write about fairness and equality and working towards making sure that girls and women are treated fairly and equally with the same opportunities. And that will go perfectly with our curriculum because that's exactly what we're doing. As I said, that's just pretty much what I have planned, but I imagine as I continue forward, I'll probably throw in some other things. Um, I also wanted to include some other activity ideas, not ones necessarily that I'm planning, but I think anytime if you're trying to look at including current events or taking something like what's happening now, a movement or an important time in your immediate world, so something that's happening locally, different ways to include it. Some of these things are not things that are super easy for me to necessarily include based on the age of my students, but some of it could be. There's always a way to kind of modify things, but I wanted to give a few other ideas of activities that you can include if you're looking to do something similar. Writing a blog post. So this is something, if my students were older, I would really be interested in doing this. It's just very taxing. My students are beginning readers and writers. So to type something up, it is very taxing. Although just recently, they actually do have experience in typing up in Google Slides, but like I said, it takes a long time. And when we completed our prior unit to the one that we're on right now, I had them each write a slide with a sentence saying what they learned. But like I said, it just takes so long to do that. Sometimes you have to weigh, like, is it worth giving up something else? I don't know. But definitely, if my students were a little more fluent in typing, I would be so interested in them writing, maybe each writing a blog post or contributing to one blog post about the different women that they're learning about. But again, you use this with any current event, anything that they're learning. Making a class newspaper, maybe each of them contribute an article to the paper regarding their learning or their understanding of the current event. A podcast. I used to have a student segment that I've not done at all this year. And it's just, again, because I have such limited time, every time I did a student segment, it meant that I couldn't be working with students, that I was there kind of helping them. If my students were a little more independent or if I had a little more time in the classroom, I think I would still be doing that, but it just got a little more difficult because it just meant having to give up certain things that I was doing. But I love the idea of a student podcast. I think that's great, especially when you have all the pieces together, making it possible to do that. Something that any of us can do is taking what's happening currently and then connecting it with history. One of the books that Get Epic has is looking at women and sports and historically what they've not been able to do. So I'm going to be using that as one of the books that I read to my students. It's kind of long, so I may have to break it up. But I love the idea of them understanding that this is actually something that, is not a new issue, that women have been having to fight for their equal rights since really the beginning of time. And I really want them to see that connection. But with any current event, if you can connect it to something historically, I think it's very impactful and just let students understand and the connection. And then, of course, debates and discussions, which I've already kind of discussed at the beginning of this episode, was discussions are so powerful. Students you get to understand what students already think and feel. It gives them an opportunity to have voice in the classroom and just, express themselves, which I think is so important for students. They need to be able to feel like they're heard. They need to be heard, and that's a great platform in doing that. And then just kind of understanding what knowledge they're coming from, as well as hearing other perspectives from other students. It's just a way to open up all of that. So those are just a few ideas. Of course, there are many other ways that you can use current events and things that are happening in our world to bring that insight back into the classroom. So that is it, you guys. It is now time for our wins and fails for the week. So definitely, I would say a big win for the week is having being able to kind of tie in what's happening immediately in our world into the classroom. Sometimes that's difficult. Like I said, I really had to kind of look at my schedule and figure out how I could do that. But after you look at your schedule and you figure out how you're going to bring it into the classroom, it just makes it so much easier. But if you don't do that immediate step, then you'll never make time for it. So I would say that would be a win. And like I said, I started that last week and I will be continuing that this week. Fail for the week, getting sick. Nothing I can do about that. It's part of being a human. Sometimes we get sick and it really puts you behind. Unfortunately, there is not much to be done in that case. So the good news is, though, I was able to stay home a couple of days and recuperate, so that was good. All right, you guys, that is it. That is going to conclude today's episode. I would love to hear from you if you have other ideas, other ways that you tie in current events or important happenings in the world into your classroom. You can tweet to me. My handle is at TammyJ123. That's at TAMIJ123. Until next time.